Hello, and welcome to the Nourishing Our Riverlands Podcast. I'm Jaimie Ritchie, and I am the host, editor, and producer of this podcast. In this podcast, we will learn about what riparian restoration is and why it matters. This first episode contains key pieces from my interviews with various experts in the field of water resources who are working to keep our river and our riverlands healthy. This episode features John Fleck, Paul Tashjian, Todd Caplan, Peggy Norton, and Kim Eichorst. John Fleck is the author of many books, including Water is for Fighting Over and Other Myths About Water in the West. He was the director of water resources at UNM, and he works primarily with water law in the Southwest, including the Colorado River Compact. Paul Tashjian is a New Mexican who has worked as a hydrologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Southwestern region for 26 years. Todd Caplan was the Natural Resources Director on a 90,000-acre American Indian reservation where he developed grant-funded programs in river floodplain, habitat restoration, rangeland management, water resources, and community outreach and education. Peggy Norton is the president of the Bosque Neighborhood Association, and Kim Eichorst is the Bosque Environment Management Plan, BEMP's Science and Research Director. In this podcast, we are focusing on the Albuquerque Bosque, which can also be referred to as the Middle Rio Grande area. It is defined as the stretch of the Rio Grande River that lies between Cochiti Dam and Elephant Butte Dam. I'll start off by defining riparian restoration. Riparian refers to the zone that is near the river, and restoration involves making changes to help a landscape to thrive, and often involves counteracting our previous actions, such as channeling a river or introducing non-native species to the area. So riparian restoration is when we alter a landscape near a river to better serve the plants and animals that live there. By the Rio Grande, salt cedar thickets are replacing the cottonwood galleries. Many riparian restoration efforts involve removing salt cedar because the cottonwoods are dying off. To begin, Kim will tell us about charismatic cottonwoods, and Todd will tell us why we are removing salt cedar.
Cottonwoods have an incredible structure. They're, even as a scientist, they're very charismatic trees.
Why specifically were you trying to remove the salt cedar?
Well, I think the biggest driver for the tribe was, it was just a wall of 15 to 25 foot tall trees that have they pose a very significant fire hazard. A lot of the bosque fires that, we've had a lot of bosque fires, especially starting around early 2000s, in Albuquerque in particular, but also down in south of Bernalillo County in Valencia and Socorro counties. So a lot of the money that has gone into salt cedar eradication in the Middle Rio Grande has been driven, well, in large part by the fire issue, but also with just an interest in trying to remove this non-native plant and try to replace it with native species. So it's been sort of a twofold emphasis, but fire is sort of creates an urgency to remove it from these sites.
Todd will now describe why maintenance of the restoration projects is so crucial.
One of the problems that we found with river rehabilitation, not just in the Middle Rio Grande, but in other highly regulated rivers in the West, is that a lot of money goes towards, designing and constructing these, rehabilitation projects, but very little attention is given to the long-term stewardship of these rehabilitation projects. And what we're finding is because these rivers have been so drastically altered, you can't just build these projects and then walk away and expect them to continue to function. And I think there's a great role for the communities that live along these rivers to take on an important stewardship role. That's really a big gap right now in how we manage our rivers. So I think that there's opportunities for students. There's opportunity, at all levels, grade school, graduate school, college. But there's also opportunities for community groups and to take a role in not only some of the citizen science and monitoring, but also in the actual physical stewardship and maintenance of these sites. So I think that that's something that I hope becomes a more common conversation in, circles talking about rivers and restoration. I have spent a lot of my career, in fact, all of my career, working on this stuff. And it's really hard to watch, so many people working hard to try to do restoration projects and do the right things. And you see them working well for a while, and then you walk away and you come back a few years later and you go, boy, these projects have unraveled. And, I think that acknowledging that is likely to happen in these drastically altered systems, we have to take a longer view as a society than we have up to now.
Switching gears, Paul is going to tell us about how agriculture actually helps a river and why we don't have to decide between helping the fish and helping the farmers. Why is it so important to have the agriculture so that the river flows? What is the connection there?
The connection is that the water being delivered to agricultural fields also is the same water then that returns to the river. There are these places along the agricultural network that are called outfalls where the water is kicked back to the river. So having that water in the system going to the fields, but then there's always some water left over, and that's going back to the river. So during dry times of the year, if agriculture wasn't functioning in this valley, there wouldn't be water going to the farms, and as well, there wouldn't be water going back to the river to keep the river whole, and it would be that much more dry. I just think that I just know that, like, having seen like the politics around water and the river in the 90s and 2000s, when it was really became this fish versus farmer thing, like, somehow these were opposing things. Like you either say the fish or you could say the farmers. And I just think it's time to let that go and realize that, hey, the fish and the farmer, not the fish or the farm, fish and the farmer, and that this is our agro ecosystem, and keeping the farmers in business and actively receiving water is as important to the river as some of these other activities.
Next, Peggy tells us why the bosque is important to her and why we need to protect this area. What's your favorite part about protecting the bosque and doing what you do?
In protecting it is that it's a very valuable treasure. It's unique. It's, I believe, the largest bosque either in the world or the country. By channeling the river, we have totally destroyed the bosque in the long term. And the cottonwoods, the golden cottonwoods, the great horned owl nests, the porcupines, the toads you used to see that you don't see there. That's another effect from the pesticides at Candelaria Preserve. There have been no toads seen there since.
Oh, wow.
And I just love having that. I live a 5-minute drive from it, so I can drive to different places along it, and they're all different.
Yeah.
And there's the crusher fine trails, which maybe I oppose, but they still make walking and biking a little nicer in it. But then there's other spots where you hardly ever see anybody still. And just the peace, the solitude, the vegetation, the water.
Yeah.
If you're from Taos, you know a little about water.
Yeah.
I mean, just to walk along a ditch, and I walk near the Montano Wasteway, and there's water rushing there. You almost feel like you're in a mountain stream.
Kim is now going to tell us about her amazing program where 4th graders help gather data about specific spots on the Rio Grande. The groundwater level is declining in these areas, and the 4th graders get to measure by how much it is changing.
When we take students out, I used to do little informal surveys. How many of you have never been to the river before? And it was usually about half. And for a lot of our schools that we work with, the students live within a mile, maybe 2 of the river, and they've never been.
Oh my gosh.
And so already there's this disconnect from your local landscape, your local resources, and we've had students, that at the beginning of the year they don't like going out on BEM field trips, right? It's very uncomfortable for them, and certainly when we have sites where there are trails and you go off the trail to monitor depth to groundwater, and we'll have students that they don't want to go off the trail because that's unknown, that's scary, what else is out there? And then to see by the end of the school year, it's their favorite thing about 4th grade was that we got to do this trip and go out to our site every month. And one of my favorite stories, one of the schools that we work with, the international school, they used to have their 4th graders go out, and the last trip of the year for a few years, the 4th graders would go out with the 3rd graders. And at the end of the year, the 4th graders would teach the 3rd graders, this is how we monitor a BEM site. This is how we monitor depth to the groundwater. This is how we monitor precipitation. This is how we collect all the leaf litter. And this is what you get to do next year. And just listening to the students say, like, this is the best thing about 4th grade. Or, or the one student who all year I thought she was completely disconnected, didn't really pay attention, didn't ever look like she wanted to be at the site. And then at the end of the year, she knew exactly how to explain, this is how we monitor depth of groundwater. You have to pay attention to where the black notch is. Don't bend the tape because you'll ruin your equipment. Like, she was so precise. And it was like, all this time, when she was like, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. And at the end of the year, she'd had enough time for it to mean something, as opposed to when students get to go out one time, and maybe a couple of them are super excited and will remember it. But if it's a one-time field trip, quite often it just blurs into the rest of the school year. But getting to go out every month was such a noticeable impact on the students and what they took away from that grade.
That is so cool.
It was, and they got to do just our monthly monitoring, but a lot of students would also get to do pitfall traps where we collect surface active arthropods, and listening to them talk about, where do you get to collect bugs? like I used to be really afraid of them, but some of the beetles are so pretty, and they're just amazing that they're far more willing to be engaged when they are outdoors, when they get to be in that space and actively do stuff. And like I said, once they're over that hump of this is the unknown, then they own it, and they know exactly where to go. They have their maps so they can navigate the site, and by the end of the year, they're totally showing the adults, no, it's over here. Yeah. So, and then, like I said, even we now have over 25 years of data at our oldest sites, and to be able to show students, here are your data points that you have contributed to this larger data set, and we can see at some of our sites the slow decline in groundwater. Mm-hmm. We can see at some of our sites where after the flooding event, the cottonwoods came in successfully or didn't. We can see at some of our sites where the cottonwoods were so young, they were not sexually mature yet, so there were no flowers. And then 15 years in, we're starting to collect flowering reproductive parts from the cottonwoods. And so you can see that they're starting to take over at this site. And when you're collecting one data point, it's maybe exciting for some and probably not for others. But then when you can see this larger picture, like that your data point is where we started to learn this. I think that is part of the power of what we get to do.
We'll finish with John telling us how climate change affects this system by changing the quantity of water in our rivers. How does climate change specifically affect how we have to change our water usage?
So climate change science can't predict specifically how much water we have 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now. But it clearly points toward there being less. For really the main reason is because it's hotter. And so you get more evaporation, you get more what's called evapotranspiration, which is the water used by plants, evaporation and the transpiration of plants. And it's warmer, plants have a longer growing season, they're going to use more water, and the ones up in the headwaters regions where the snow is falling, the trees pop out earlier, they use more water over the course of the year. Less of that water ends up in the less of the stuff that falls as snow ends up melting and coming down into the rivers. You get more evaporation off those snowpacks. You get drier soils, which soak up more water. So temperature is just a water killer. And climate science has a harder time of telling us whether precipitation will go up or down. The climate models just have a hard time with this. It's kind of beyond their skill set right now. It's just a highly chaotic stochastic process. But we know that for whatever amount of rain and snow falls, less water is in the river and available for our use. So climate change means less water. You know, my friend Brad Udall likes to say, and he's pretty sure he didn't invent the phrase, but he's the one who says it so much that we identify with him. Climate change is water change. The availability of water, the changing nature of how water arrives and we make use of it, is the dominant way climate change impacts us as human and natural communities. It's a dominant mechanism by which climate change translates into ecosystem function in our everyday lives.
That's all, folks. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Nourishing Our Riverlands, and I hope that you learned something of value from it. Let's protect and nourish our bosque and other riparian areas so that future generations can enjoy their glory. For now, go somewhere and enjoy nature. I'd like to say thank you to everyone that I interviewed for this project, and also thank you for listening.